Welcome to IT Emotion, where we make autonomous IT entertaining and informative. My name is Sun.
And I'm Josh. We're your hosts. Today we're talking to Richard Lee, product owner at Telstra. Everybody give it up for Richard!
Welcome to the show, Richard. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hello, I'm Richard. I'm a product owner at Telstra, and I look after a team of 8 developers.
Awesome. Well, that's really great. Thanks for getting on the show with us, Richard. I've heard that you are quite the kung fu master yourself, and we have a little game that we want to tease out just to learn a little bit more about your knowledge. I guess, Josh, you wanna kick it off with the first?
All right. So if someone were going to try to grab you by the neck, how would you react? Show us your move.
So what you need to do is first stop them from choking you. Then you need to jam your hand into their face to prevent them from finishing you off.
All right. Awesome. Let's say someone's running at you from behind. What do you do?
Running at you from behind? Okay, so for that one, you should basically do a hello, but you turn around in this direction, high to low.
What if someone's coming at you trying to stab you with a knife?
You run. You just run. you do not play with people with knives. All they need to do is just like this.
Fair enough. So I think we have one more set of questions that we wanted to ask you. You're a manager, so you've had to interview tons of people in your organization. Share with some of our guests some of the best interview questions that you've either heard or you ask when you're interviewing.
If you walk from the back of the train to the front of the train and the train is traveling at the speed of light, are you walking faster than the speed of light?
Well, I mean,
so that's one question I ask sometimes to see how people think.
I mean, that's a question about relativity, right? So in the frame of reference of the train, you're moving at about 5 kilometers an hour or something like that. But from the frame of reference outside, you just get stretched out.
Apparently, if you travel at the speed of light, time stops. So that means you become functionally immortal.
That sounds fun. Where do I sign up?
Yes, if you get asked a coding question, the one that I got asked was, can you code the Knight's Tour?
Oh, that's
and I was like, oh, geez, I hadn't done my homework on backtracking or anything like that, and it was just sprung on me on the spot.
Oh, that's a tough one to be sprung on the spot. So I'll give my favorite interview question is more of a category. I like to ask at least one problem-solving question, because all the people that I work with, whether they're in a sales role, a marketing role, an engineering role, product role, they're always trying to find a problem to solve, right? Like that's the hard part of the job is you're given a problem, you got to solve it. So when it's engineers, I'll ask a numerical reasoning question. How many balloons would it take to fill up a room, especially if the room is kind of a weird shape? You get an idea of their ability to kind of break the problem down and also where they're going to set limits. If someone's sitting there and they're working for 25 minutes and you told them they had 5 minutes to work, it gives you an idea that they're having a harder time keeping the constraints of the problem in their mind. And whereas if on the other hand, if someone just blurts out 24 million, right? They didn't take the time to think. If it's a non-technical role, I don't tend to go for numerical reasoning as much as something like, all right, if I had to fill this room up with water, how would you do it? And then you can kind of get an idea of, do they rely on other people? Do they have some kind of idea of things that they might be worried about? Like, well, there's electrical outlets, water goes in. So I like to ask those kind of questions because it gives a little bit of an insight into how someone's going to perform on the job when they're given those tricky problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Richard, it's been awesome getting to know you just via game. Figured at this point in time, the guests have just been really wanting to know about your career history. Can you tell us? It seems like you have an extensive history at Telstra. Can you share us, from your humble beginnings, whether it's before Telstra to where you are now?
So I started in the telco industry working for a small startup in the boonies around Victoria, Australia. The place I worked at sold SDH and Sonnet muxes. So there's like pizza box sized routers that do optical transmission. After that, I joined the optical vision division at Telstra. And from there, I moved around Telstra for 15 years or so.
Wow, 15
When I
years.
first joined the
So
company,
that
it was
place.
the average serving time was 15 years.
Wow. So you're at this point keeping the average up, right, as opposed to dragging it down. That's a transition point. You've been at one employer for quite a while, with that 15 years, which isn't so common in a lot of places, but it is common at Telstra. What do you think it is that makes it that way there?
I think that Telstra is quite stable in terms of people there are really genuinely quite nice, and they sort of treat dealings with each other as like a family, particularly in the engineering division. So it's eventually, as you become an expert, you just become part of the furniture.
Well, what do you think are the keys for a large company like Telstra to continue to be productive and dynamic? I mean, obviously, it's easier to be agile and pivot when you're a smaller company, less people. But for a company the size of Telstra, how do you stay on top of what's happening in the industry?
I think it's important to have really good industry leaders in the company who recognize that there's changes that need to happen. And the reason is because as the industry moves, if you're not careful, if you have large legacy systems that you have to look after, those can weigh you down, especially if you have to refactor them out or work on them. Recently, the at the top from Telstra, they arranged for Agile at Scale to be deployed throughout the company. There's still vestiges of the waterfall thing because large companies and waterfalls and stuff like that. But I think we're making pretty good inroads. That's the way to do it.
Have you folks dabbled into some of the safe frameworks or less, or are you guys doing your own version of kind of agile and scrum or?
It's 90% safe, maybe 10% of our own. The last 10% being dependent on each of the technical teams to run it.
Sure. Were there any bumps along the way you'd want to talk about in adopting an agile framework, coming from such a heavy waterfall background? Telstra's an old company, so there's a lot of inertia there.
I think there's probably some flaws in the agile framework to a degree, in the sense that when you're a large institutional company, finance is really important, and as well as the expectations of our large institutional customers. So you need to be able to promise that you want to deliver to the market by this date, and you can't say, "Oh yeah, I've just got this product. I'm just going to keep iterating on." Especially when for large telcos, capex is really important, particularly in Australia.
Yeah, I mean the constraint of capital is a persistent thing, but depending, like you say, Australia is a different market than the United States, different than Canada, different than China, right? Everyone's got a different relationship to how they access capital markets. You kind of mentioned that idea that you've got large institutional customers and they're looking for predictability of delivery date. Have you found that resistance from those sort of customers to using that sort of agile customer feedback approach of, all right, we're going to deliver the first iteration of this in an MVP in a couple months, and then every 2 weeks we're going to show it to you and get feedback? Have you seen resistance to that? Has it been hard to accomplish for different reasons, or is it something they embrace but you just don't get the level of long-term predictability?
It depends. If you show them something shiny, generally customers really like it. That being said, when MVPs sort of become a bit of a dirty word in the industry because it's sort of signs of half finished, right? So
yeah, it kind of adopts that idea of enough, right? But is enough ever enough? Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe it's the case that a lot of
you sometimes have to exceed your customer expectations.
Yeah.
Especially if you're at the higher end of the margin of the market.
Definitely. Richard, you've been with Telstra such a long time, and you've grown within the company, right? You've had multiple positions within the company. You got promoted to a manager, I think. How long have you been a manager for?
About a year and a half now.
Let me ask you this. Through these different promotions, how much do you think that was your intention to get a promotion, or how much do you think that was more luck by chance, like it was serendipitous,
or just opportunities that are out there,
or just the fact that there's opportunities? I mean, how easy is it to predict promotions, more or less?
It's 50-50. You have to be able to level up and step up and work at that level. But it's not always obvious what steps you need to take in order to operate at that level. So when I've got line engineers and grads working for me, I try to coach them on what behaviors that are expected of them, so that if they want to operate at a senior dev level or even at a manager level, what they're expected of them.
I find it can be difficult for someone who's earlier in their career to necessarily understand and accept it, right? They might understand the words, but it doesn't really resonate with them because they haven't, figured out what some of the stuff they need to do to get in the middle is. So, do you find that there's the same thing, that you kind of need to match the level, but also give people a little bit of a taste of the future?
Indeed. Part of it is like allowing them to do a little bit of self-discovery, like just let them go and struggle a little bit, but tell them that you're going to be there to help them as well. So it's a balancing act with that. The other one is to remind them that, the company has objectives, we have customers who are paying us. And you'd be surprised at how many engineers don't really consider that.
Yeah.
Well, that actually leads to another question. You recently got promoted to be a manager. How has your role changed from being an individual contributor to a manager?
I think I was doing some sort of managerial activity before that point. The key is that now I don't have to ask the manager permission to lead initiatives now. I basically run some of my own initiatives, which is the good thing about being a manager.
Yeah.
You have authority.
Yep. Yeah.
It's not really that much authority, really, because ultimately all you can do is ask your staff members nicely to do stuff.
That's right.
And incentivize them to do it.
It's very different than leading by. So there's obviously leading with authority, and then there's leading with influence. Did you lead a lot more with influence before as opposed to now? And how does that dynamic change, right? When you have that influence before and then all of a sudden you become someone's manager, how do you manage that dynamic?
I think the only thing that changes is the incentives that are offered, in the sense that you give feedback on your staff members to essentially to HR, affecting their remuneration. That's one of those things that happens as part of being a manager. Other than that, everything is still the same, in the sense that I'm still in the trenches with the troops. But now I also have to start having conversations with stakeholders, especially if they're the ones paying for the features. So.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you see the distinction, kind of on that same note, between beyond just that ability to make decision and looking at stakeholders? Do you see other distinctions between like an engineering manager and a lead engineer?
That's a good question, actually. I don't see that there's that much of a distinction to a degree. A manager has to do more paperwork, for instance, like putting in funding requests and putting in interactions. So in order in Telstra to arrange for integration to another department, you have to fund and put together an interaction. While tech leads in our groups, they tend to be given more discrete objectives, and they are often given one or two subordinates to work with them.
Yeah, I also see in a lot of organizations that tech leads or lead engineers, they do have a strong leadership role in terms of people listening to what they say and taking it seriously. And if they say, hey, we should build it this way, they want to build it that way. But they tend to be a lot more hands-on with the work than the manager, who tends to be a lot more focused on interacting with the external parties and the paperwork and, making sure that each person has what they need to succeed. Have you seen that same thing?
Yes, I have. And I think one of the challenges for me is that, personally, is that I'm still doing the tech lead role to a degree. So it's hard to just let go and then do the manager role, especially if you're constrained with resources.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And everyone seems to be constrained with resources most of the time. So it takes time to fully complete a transition like that.
Absolutely. So tell us, as opposed to being a more functional manager, what are the advantages of being a technical manager?
Oh, the good thing about being a technical manager is that you don't have to go to your tech leads to ask them what needs to be done. You can actually scope the work yourself to a degree, and then you say, well, before I commit to it, first the other party has to provide funding for the feature, and the tech lead has to agree that it's doable within that time frame. That being said, because I've been a tech lead in the past, I'm got maybe about 70, 80% confidence that my estimates are correct.
Yeah, so it seems like it gives you greater confidence in decision
Much
making,
faster to
better
scope
ability
features
to
then.
relate to the team. Do you feel like it helps provide better products and outcomes than if the manager had less of a technical background?
I think it does, but it's not the main thing that decides that. What I'm finding is a bigger challenge is what happens if you have legacy systems that you have to work with.
Mm-hmm.
Knowing those systems back to front helps, but it's really the technical debt that you have to deal with that determines how productive the manager is rather than how skilled they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like there's any disadvantages of being a manager with a technical background?
Oh, absolutely. The main disadvantage is the temptation always to just get back in the trenches and do it yourself.
Yeah, the
One of the
temptation's
things
always
that's
there.
important for a manager to learn is to say no.
Yeah, you have to trust your team to be able to deliver it and coach them on how they can improve if you need to, but not do it for them, right?
But sometimes, especially if you're coaching them, you have to show them how you would have done it, but you don't do all of the work for them. You just give them, you share screens, show a few like pages that you could have gone to, and by doing so, you
Yeah.
save them 6 or 7 hours of trying to do the phishing themselves.
Right. Yeah, it's a really being that sort of mentor, right? Having more of a mentorship role as opposed to doing the work. So it sounds like you try to take that disadvantage of having the temptation to do the work yourself and try to turn it into an advantage by being a better mentor.
Yeah. From what I've heard, you've worked remote for a very long time, pre-pandemic, right? Most of us, I think, have been working remote, mainly post-pandemic. But tell us, what are the keys to management to a remote workforce, right? It's different now when you're managing people
So
when they're at home.
the key and most important thing for being a manager, which one of the Telstra staff who's been serving for 40 years told me, he said that you should have a meeting with each of your team members once a week. It used to represent a manager walking around the floor and just walking around and saying, hey, how are you going? How can I help you? And making sure that none of your team members are stuck, because sometimes the team members will get stuck on something and they're suffering, but they feel that if they were to say to others, oh, don't know how to get past this, then maybe their competence would be questioned or something. I want to just completely dispel that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the regular check-ins. What other tips do you have for people who are doing remote work
The
to
key
be
is
effective?
to have a area just for yourself, and just to be able to close it off. One of the challenges, particularly with audio, is when I talk, the audio is quite loud. So having your own like room that you can just lock, it's like having your own office in the main office, right?
100%. So you told me in the past that you feel retention in engineering departments is critical, right? Because otherwise people leave with that knowledge. Explain a little bit more about why that's
Yeah, if
important.
people leave with that knowledge, it's very challenging to rebuild that knowledge and rebuild back up that skill base and regain control of some of the systems that they were looking after.
That's really great. It seems like you folks have a really good rotational program within your organization. Um, that sounds like the best way in some ways to retain employees in general. Keeps them interested, keeps them learning, perhaps even opportunity or career growth. within those rotations, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Quarterly, I discuss with my staff members, do you really like what you're doing? Are there opportunities for you to move sideways, to do something slightly different within the team? And occasionally, particularly if somebody's under the pump, I'll arrange for them to be relieved by another staff member, not as a question of their competence, but just make sure that they don't burn out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One thing I've observed is that when it comes to engineers, the experience they build up at an organization is very valuable. And when someone walks out the door, they don't work for the company anymore, that experience goes with them. And some of it's just, general transferable knowledge, but a lot of it is learning the code base, learning how the network's built, learning how the servers are configured, right? Like all those details that it takes a long time to learn. And it's really hard to replace that, right? It takes a long time. So having that kind of retention, being able to reach out if there's a question and get an answer really goes a long way.
So Richard, this has been really great. We appreciate you joining us this early in the morning for you. I think it's 5, almost 6 o'clock in the morning at this point now, right? It's almost reasonable to ask you to join us. Quick question for us is, where can we learn a little bit more about you, about what you do, and maybe share that with our audience?
Oh, I guess I just add my LinkedIn page. So other than that, I try to keep a relatively low profile, but you might see me at the next ScienceLogic event.
There you go.
Right. That's a great place to meet Richard.
All right. Well, Richard, thanks again for joining us today. And for everyone listening, we hope you got as much value as we did. Everybody give it up one more time for Richard. We appreciate you joining us, Richard.
Josh,
Richard.
thank you.
We look forward to meeting you next time. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please hit the subscribe button on your favorite podcast app. We're available on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, and many other platforms. We release episodes on a regular basis. If you'd like to find out more or watch more episodes, you can do so at sciencelogic.com/podcast.